Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It's Wednesday night at Christ Church International. I'm Billy Gann, and we are very, very honored and happy that you chose to be with us tonight. I thank you very much for being here. We're here to celebrate our pastor's birthday. It's been his birthday all day long, and he's 21. He told me, and I believe him. But we're so thankful to have such a wonderful man as a pastor, but we're so glad that you're here tonight. Just relax, but yet let God move into your life. Let him move in and move in you. In Jesus' name.
You say to us, reply, your face we seek. Come teach us, Lord, reveal your ways, anoint us for the greater thing. Gathered with one thirst and hunger, here to lift up glory and wonder, here to cry out, come and fill this place. We have gathered With one thirst and your glory in this place. We worship you as you reveal your glory in this place. We worship you as you reveal your glory in this place. We worship you as you reveal your glory in this place. Hallelujah, Lord, and hallelujah, Lord. Hallelujah, Lord. Hallelujah, Lord. Hallelujah, Lord. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. We have gathered with one thirst and hunger. We're here to lift up your glory and wonder. We're here to cry out, come and fill this place. 'Cause we have gathered with one thirst and hunger. We're here to lift up your glory and wonder. We're here to cry out, come and fill this place. Come and fill this place. Come and fill this place. We have gathered with one thirst and hunger. We're here to lift up your glory and wonder. We're here to cry out, come and fill this place.
Come and fill this place. Wow. You know, the Bible says that when two or more gather, there he is in the midst. But not only that, God is omnipresent. He's everywhere. He's with you right now. You know, during these times, we've had to adapt, just like everybody else. And in your giving, your tithes and your offerings, we've had to go through several different ways, and we've made it available to you to go online, to also bring it here to the church if you'd like, or Post Office Box 5987, Dothan, Alabama, 36302. You can do it like that. But we're so thankful and honored that you are here tonight, and we love you, and we pray God's best always upon each and every one of you. And now, Pastor David DelVecchio.
Thank you, Billy. Well, good evening. It is a pleasure to see you all again and to go into Mark. We're going to be speaking our 20th time on the Gospel of Mark. We talked about last time some of the things that the Lord had revealed through this gospel, through Mark's voice, that Peter had spoken to him about, because Peter is the one that gave Mark all the information that was necessary to write this book, because Mark was not there. Start with me in Mark 8. I'm reading starting in verse 11. The Pharisees came out and began to argue with Jesus, demanding of him a sign from heaven to test him. Now, I'll understand that Jesus had just arrived on the shore. He had just disembarked from the ship or the boat. He's walking toward the city. He is met by scribes and Pharisees, a group of individuals intent on destroying him. It is their desire to find something about him or in him or something that he says so they can stone him to death. They were sent by the Sanhedrin, sent to find cause to eliminate this, what they refer to as an impostor, this individual who's coming to take away our reign, our rule, our power, because he does things that no one else has ever done. So people are following him by the masses. But sighing deeply in his spirit, Jesus said, "Why does this generation demand a sign? I assure you, no sign will be given to this generation." Then he left them, got on board the boat again, and went to the other side. They had forgotten to take bread, his disciples that were with him in the boat, and had only one loaf with them in the boat. Then he commanded them, "Watch out! Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod." Jesus turns his back on these evil men, gets back into the boat, and goes to the eastern shore of the lake. It seems rather apparent that the western shore of the lake, there's a large population with food readily available. But where they're heading, the eastern shore, was sparse. Sparse, no food available, more people than food. Why didn't they learn that lesson last time? When you were with us before, you'll know that on 2 separate occasions they forgot to take food. That's why we have the miracles that Jesus performed. Matthew records that they did not realize that they only had one loaf of bread until they arrived on the eastern shore. Really? They've done this twice, and they still can't seem to remember to do the obvious thing. Bring food with them, especially since they know where they're going. There is no food. Jesus has just clashed with the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees on this occasion. And without breaking stride, he says to his apostles something about bread, which has nothing to do with bread at all, but everything to do with warning them about people who think and behave like these that he just encountered. Mark substitutes Herod for the Sadducees, but he's not referring directly to Herod at all. He's referring to the fact that Herod and the Sadducees are of like character, because Herod was not a Sadducee. Mark does not explain what Jesus intended when he referred to leaven or yeast. However, Matthew tells us that it refers to the doctrine of the Pharisees and the scribes. Doctrine and moral principles always go together. The former produces the latter. Pharisees set up a false holiness, and Herod is a false liberalism. What a combination. Leaven is used here in an evil sense. The disciples failed to understand completely what Jesus had just said to them. They were of the opinion that Jesus was referring to them forgetting to bring food again, this being the third time. So they associated the bread with the leaven and not the characters who have just attacked Jesus. Verse 15. Then Jesus commanded them, "Watch out! Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod." They were discussing among themselves that they did not have any bread. Aware of this, he said to them, "Why are you discussing that you do not have any bread? Don't you understand or comprehend? Is your heart hardened?" Everything from this point on is Jesus rebuking his disciples in the form of questions. Read it with me, verse 18. Don't you have eyes? Are you blind? Don't you have ears? Are you deaf? And where's your memory? What is your thinking capacity? When I broke the 5 loaves for 5,000, how many baskets full of pieces of bread did you collect? 12, they told him. After all that you've been taught, all that you have seen, All that you have done, and you're still blind and deaf, is all I've done for nothing? It is obvious from this that Jesus expects us to use our natural intelligence, our memory, our thought processes to reason and make decisions and determinations about what is being spoken or what we see. Behind our reasoning abilities is our heart, the center of the person who we are. Our mind and our abilities are never independent of our heart. Our intellect, our mind, our ability to reason are connected to our hearts, and in fact, are ruled by our hearts. Our intellect reasons as our will demands, never the other way around. Our intellect makes decisions, has thoughts and reasons as our will demands it to, never the other way around. Case in point is the false reasoning of scribes and Pharisees. Jesus destroyed the arguments that they brought against him, but didn't change them at all. Didn't change their will, didn't change their focus, didn't change their purpose. They remained the same. Our eyes, our ears, our memory exhibit our heart. We can see and hear, and what we remember are heart related. Once again, the case in point is the scribes and Pharisees. Nothing penetrated because their heart was exceedingly evil. Jesus has asked his disciples, the apostles, a question in verse 18. And it's directed at their failure to see and hear and remember. Remember what is important as opposed to what is fleeting and temporal. Like a loaf of bread and forgetting to bring it along, being prepared for the obvious. Verse 18, do you have eyes and not see? What, are you blind? Do you have ears and do not hear? Are you deaf? And do you not remember? What happened to your memory? Are you not thinking? Jesus is very angry, and he speaks to them vehemently. In verse 19, Jesus begins to stir their memories. Jesus said, recall, please, the 2 miracles that just took place. Remember them and what you personally got out of them. Recall how many baskets you took up the first time, and then recall how many baskets you took up the second time. Verse 19 of Mark 8. When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of bread did you collect? 12, they told him. When I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of pieces of bread did you collect? 7, they said. And he said to them, don't you understand yet? Suddenly they did. They put 2 and 2 together. And I can just hear them thinking, how can we remember these miracles and then forget and think that we're being scolded because we failed to bring a loaf of bread or more than a loaf of bread? How foolish we have been because we have not seen the truth that is all around us. Verse 22, then they came to Bethsaida. They brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and brought him out of the village, spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him. He asked him, now picture this, Jesus spits in a man's face. As far as you're concerned and you're standing there watching him and you're with him, he walks up to a man and spits right in his face. Hello, my name is Jesus, and I'm here to heal you. And he says to the man when he spits in his face, do you see anything? That's the way it appears, but that's not the way it went down. He looked up and said, I see people. They look to me like trees walking. Now, how does a blind man know what trees look like? Verse 25, again, Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes, and he saw distinctly, and he was cured and could see everything clearly. Then he sent him home saying, don't even go into the village. Jesus has been for some time ministering to his disciples, the apostles, from the surrounding regions. He doesn't want to go back into the main part of the city where the cosmopolitan areas are because he does not want to be pushed and pressed to do what he's been doing since he's been here for 3 years. He's going now for the last 4 to 6 months, and he's spending as much time in the surrounding areas. He is still ministering, he's still healing, he's still delivering, but he's spending time teaching the apostles because when he leaves, their whole life is going to change dramatically. Recall with me the deaf man who stammered with his speech. People couldn't understand what he said. That was brought to him a chapter ago in chapter 7. Let's go back and review chapter 7, verse 32 and 34. They brought to him a deaf man who also had a speech difficulty and begged Jesus to lay his hand on him. So he took him away from the crowd privately after putting his fingers into the man's ears and spitting. Now you have to picture that too. He touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed deeply and said to him, "Ephphatha, be opened." Jesus uses the same technique as he did in chapter 7 with this other man in chapter 8, verse 23. You recall that he stuck his fingers into the ears of this man because the man could not hear and he couldn't speak. When he stuck his fingers into that man's ears, that man knew something about my ears is going to change. And then Jesus spit on his fingers and he put it on the man's tongue. And that man realized that his mouth was going to be different and he was going to speak different and people were going to understand him because he was now going to be comprehensible or comprehensible. And here he is again, another man who is deaf. He takes this man outside the town also. There is once again no noise and no other outside sound interference to detract from what Jesus intends to do to this man. And Jesus uses sign language to get this man's individual, undivided attention. Jesus has a purpose in this elaborate procedure for healing this man. It's not going to be like any other, including the one we just read about. He could have healed the man anywhere, including in front of the crowd, but that was not his plan. Recall with me something I said last time. Healing is not done to impress a crowd, and it's not done to increase someone's faith or manufacture healing for faith. Healing is a gift to the individual. And Jesus did not need to impress anyone to do it. Jesus spits on the eyelids of this man. The man is keenly aware that something's going to happen. Jesus is going to do something to his eyes, something he cannot see, but he knows is about to happen. Immediately after spitting on the man's eyeballs or eyelids, Jesus touches his eyes with his hand. There's nothing about Jesus' spit that relates to this healing other than Jesus is making the man aware who could not see that something's going to happen to my eyes. So we don't need to have some group going around spitting in people's faces and saying, okay, that's how Jesus did it, I'm going to do it. Because if you don't tell them up front, they're going to do it. It's more remarkable that Jesus healed this man gradually than if he had healed him instantly, and he could have. Some think and have said very foolishly that Jesus needed more time for this man to be healed, and others have said things that are just as foolish. They say that because they don't really know who Jesus is. Jesus heals by his word. Jesus heals by his will. He does not need any such items such as oil or spit or time or any other medium to create a miracle, just his will. He could have done it in an instant, but he chose to make his healing elaborate, either for the man or for his disciples, but not for the crowd. Jesus did not need a second effort, as some have incorrectly written. Jesus asked the man if he sees anything, and the man replies. Jesus did not ask because he needed information as to the level of healing he was taking place, which some have said. He is not concerned that his power is going to work. It always works. Every time he speaks, something happens. He asked the man so that the man can realize he is about to be healed. Something is taking place. He is beginning to see, and he hasn't been able to see for a while. Verse 23. He took the blind man by the hand and brought him out of the village, spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him. He asked him, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look to me like trees walking." Verse 25. Again, Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes, and he saw distinctly. He was cured, and he could see everything clearly. Then he sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." Mark uses 3 verbs describing the healing. One verb, distinctly. One verb, cured. Another verb, clearly. Everything to let us know that his eyes were completely healed. When we read this in only one translation, we may lose an important feature that the translators who are translating in the Holman, one of the Bibles I prefer, missed one of the most important things they could have said. It makes the verse even more important. In the case of the ESV, or the English Standard Version, they didn't miss this word. So let's read Mark 8:25 in the English Standard Version. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored. The man had lost his eyesight. He could see at some earlier point in his life, but something happened causing him to be blind. That's how we know that he knew what trees looked like. Verse 27, and Jesus went on with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked the disciples, who do people say that I am? And they told him, John the Baptist. And others say, Elijah. And others, one of the prophets. And he asked them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Christ. And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. From this place forward, everything begins to change. We see the suffering of Jesus at literally every turn. Jesus is not requesting his disciples give him information because he doesn't need more information, especially when the information they're giving him is either bad information or wrong information. It doesn't help anyone. However, it does reveal to us how out of touch the ideas about who Jesus were. All three opinions, I think you should notice this. This is an important point. All three opinions involved resurrection. Obviously, the Jews believed in resurrection of the dead as it's based in the Old Testament, especially since they are saying that these three individuals who were dead had come back to life, and now they see them in this individual called Jesus, except, of course, the Sadducees. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. Those who read the Old Testament and say it doesn't discuss the resurrection of the dead apparently do not understand what they've read, especially since all these people, all these Jews that had come up with these three determinations, believed in it enough to think that Jesus was someone who had been resurrected from the dead. Then Jesus asked the disciples, whom do you say I am? Peter, as usual, is ready with an answer. In Matthew's account, he refers to him as Simon Peter, but Mark, because he's so close to Peter, is thinking about Peter like you would think of a brother or a father or someone that you're close, a dear, dear friend. He refers to him without the surname Simon. He refers to him as Peter. Mark is writing about what Peter told him, since Mark wasn't there. But his writing is so well done and so well cataloged that it's obvious that when he's writing about Peter, he's thinking about Peter, and he can see Peter in his mind's eye as he's putting pen on paper or parchment and telling the story that Peter has made so clear to him. And so he uses a familiar name, Peter. Recall, Peter has referred to Mark as a son. Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ, and he does it without qualification like some special name or special need. It was the Christ, the Son of the living God, Christ, the Anointed One. And he's confessing it directly, and he's confessing it to a point. Other men had given the idea that Jesus was someone who had lived before, but Peter was given by God who Jesus really was. He was given to see what other men had failed to see, because they had a false political concept of who Jesus was. So they came into the situation when they looked at Jesus blind because of their education, their knowledge, and their memories. They had scales on their eyes, and the scales made them predisposed to believe something a certain way, and they couldn't get off of that. Knowledge, education, and memories made them think that way. Verse 29. And he asked them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Christ. Mark writes 2 lines to tell us the answer that Peter gave. It's an abbreviated version of what took place. Matthew, on the other hand, writes a volume to explain the entire information to the reader. Matthew is the one that tells us about Peter and the information that God gave him, and the fact that he had the knowledge of who Jesus is, and the fact that that knowledge will be based, we will base our knowledge of the kingdom, and the church will be built upon that knowledge. Mark says, only you're the Christ. Verse 30. And he strictly charged them that to tell no one about him. Jesus did not want him to spread the word about him at this point. And recall with me again, Jesus is staying out of the major populated areas, spending time with his apostles, going to the smaller areas, going into the regions because he's trying to teach them. They're going to be emotionally destroyed when they see what's going to happen to him. He knows it. Mark 8, verse 31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Now picture Peter. Well, they're all here. Peter takes Jesus and they're walking away. They have their backs to the others. That's the picture here. And we get that picture from Mark. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing the disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, now Jesus stops and turns around. Peter's here and they are here. Get thee behind me, Satan. For you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Wow. Talk about everybody's attention. When Jesus cleansed the temple the first time, he cleansed it twice, as you recall. He spoke about the temple of his body, which the Jews would destroy, and he would raise up again. He told Nicodemus that when the Son of Man be lifted up, now it's finally time for him to speak plainly and clearly in language that they will understand exactly what's going to happen. Even though Jesus, the Messiah, is the Son of God, there will be no glorious moment, no fabulous throne for him to sit on, no royal chair, no earthly kingdom for him to reign over, but in fact, for a long time to come, anything but that. When they heard that kind of news about the kingdom of the coming Messiah and how it would be, the only way that it was going to be changed was they were going to do it. And he's telling them all these things they needed to hear. The coming Messiah, the idea about him would have to be changed. And now we are going to be the ones that show the world how that's done. Picture the test. Picture their thought process. Jesus was to be rejected by the highest Jewish court in the land, the highest Jewish regional authority, the religious authority, which was a better representative for his condemnation than just a high priest. Verse 31, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. The elders were old men with experience, men who had served their nation as judges and sat on courts, and their prominence had elevated them to become elders. They were members of the highest court or the highest group in the land. Chief priests were members of the ruling class. They were of the family of Caiaphas. They were Sadducees. The scribes were the experts in law and the interpretation of the law in the Old Testament and of the traditions of the rabbis. The apostles knew that the enemies of Jesus were members of the Sanhedrin. But now Jesus tells the disciples that they're going to succeed in their efforts to kill him. Not only will he suffer many things, but he will be killed by these people. This news shakes his apostles to the core. How can this be? How can such a thing happen to this man? This is Messiah. This is the Son of God. This can't be. Jesus is rather brief in his explanation, and perhaps his brief is because he knows that these men who loved him and been with him for 3 years and change are about to hear something that is going to rearrange everything they have ever thought. And in fact, it's doing it now. All their silent plans, all their hopes for the future with him as their master and leader, they're gone. All up in smoke. And the one they respect, they follow, they honor, and that they love is about to be taken by evil men who, as far as they are concerned, have no right to do anything that they're doing to him. And he's the Messiah. He's the Son of God. How can this be? Imagine with me the thoughts that are going through their minds. Actually, no, we can't. Even standing here talking about it, I can't imagine what they're thinking. Christ is going to be beaten, spat upon, tortured, and then murdered by men who are not worthy enough to be near him and who cannot and could not ever do or be anything like he is. And his apostles, his dearest friends and brothers, are sitting there listening to him talk to them. To lose this man that they revered because he earned their respect and their honor and their love. This is not what they believed would happen to Messiah. And now they know he's Messiah. They know for sure. But everything they had learned, everything they were taught, everything they had known and believed and remembered about Messiah was wrong. Nothing that they had been taught about him was right. You start to get a picture of this. I love him and he's leaving me, and I can't do anything about it. And everything I thought all my life about him and who he would be and how he would come and how he would take over and how he would set up his reign and rule, and none of it is going to happen. And everybody who taught me that told me a lie. It must have taken a few minutes for the entire conversation to settle into their thinking, into their minds. It didn't click into Peter's mind, and before it does, he jumps up, as usual, and puts his own 2 cents into the situation. Watch him. I love him for what he did and the reason he did it, but he was wrong. Mark 8, verse 32 and 33. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get thee behind me, Satan," or "Get behind me, Satan. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Peter has been shaken to his literal core. None of them really heard Jesus say, after 3 days there will be a resurrection. And if they did, it didn't register, because no man had ever risen after 3 days being dead except Lazarus, and Jesus is the one who raised him. Jesus said that he would rise again after 3 days. None of the Old Testament prophets had ever given that time. The closest thing we have to that time was the analogy of Jonah in the belly of the fish. Peter's reaction to the news was a display about how all of them felt. They had focused on the death, and prior to the death, the terrible suffering their master was going to go through, and not the fact that after 3 days he would rise again. I'm almost sure that later they were thinking, well, what does it mean he's going to rise again? How's that going to happen? Will that be a spiritual thing? How are we to understand that statement? I will tell you, it's one thing to sit in a chair reading this account and thinking about it, but I tell you, it's quite another to be the one sitting there when Jesus is looking at your face and telling you the news that's going to change your life forever. My heart would be broken. Even telling the story is hard. They're listening to a catastrophe that's coming at them, and they don't know how to handle what is coming, even though Jesus has spent the last 4 to 6 months telling them and preparing them for what's coming. But you can't conceive of that taking place or happening to you when all your life you've been taught something else, all your life you've believed something else, and now all of a sudden to find out everything you believed was a lie. Peter jumps up from where he's seated. He cannot accept this personal bad news without his involvement. His flesh is very much alive and his heart is breaking, and I don't blame him. After all that he and Jesus had been through together, all that Jesus had done for him, especially forgiving him for denying him, and for the love and forgiveness Jesus had shown him and all of them, this cannot happen to Jesus. There must be another way, Peter is thinking. But there wasn't. Peter had heard everything but the word resurrection in 3 days. It never registered with him. Peter began to rebuke Jesus. At the same time, Jesus was beginning to teach the disciples about his passion and his glorification. Jesus squashed what Peter was about to say at the very beginning before he ever got a chance to get on the road to his voice. Peter began but never finished what he intended to say. Boy, I wish the Lord had done some of that to me. The verb rebuked in verse 33 is one with vehemence. It is the action one would take when someone comes powerfully toward another person to show him he is very wrong. That's what Jesus did, and that's what the verb that's used here. Mark is brief, but Matthew is not. Matthew has kept the conversation intact for the reader to hear the entire dialogue. You can read it in Mark. Peter is full of emotion, fear, anger, disbelief, heartfelt anguish. Heartfelt anguish. He's about to lose the most important person in his life. Not only that, but he's about to lose the Messiah, the Son of God. My whole life has been directed toward him. When I was wrong, I was directed toward him. Peter began his dialogue but never finished. Jesus stopped him in his tracks, Mark 8:33. But turning and seeing his disciples, Mark's the only one that tells us that, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get thee behind me, Satan. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Jesus has turned around and he's facing the disciples with Peter facing and the others. Jesus does not allow this conversation to go on for any more time than you just heard. Not 1 second more. Get thee behind me. What a strong rebuke. In our day, we would translate this as, get out of my sight. Wow. The one you've loved, the one you've trusted, the one who's taught you, the one that forgave you, has just now told you, get out of my sight. This is the same exact thing that Jesus said to the devil when he ordered him out of his sight after the third temptation. Read it with me. Matthew 4:10. Then Jesus told him, "Go away, Satan. For it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Without knowing what he was saying, Peter had become the tool of Satan. Even though he had the best intentions. Now hear this, because this really has an effect on us. Even though he had the best intentions, even though his words were based and premised because of his love and respect for Jesus, he'd become the tool of Satan. There's a powerful lesson for us to learn in this fired up confrontation, which many of us have had and many of us will have. Be cautious and watch over your love. Our best understanding and intentions, watch over them, because they may, even though they come from a heart of love, even respect and honor, agree with Satan and not Christ. Just as Peter agreed with the devil and not Christ. There are so many things that Mark reveals to us, so many things about us that he reveals through others like Peter. Or like Simon, who can't seem to remember, and all the others who keep forgetting. It is a privilege to walk with the Lord. When we sit down and read this next time on our own, try as hard as you will, but you won't be able to. Put yourself in the place of these young men who have turned their lives around because of a man that they loved and respected. And they find out he is the Son of God, and they know for a fact he is. They find out he's the Messiah. They leave their place of employment, they leave their families, and they're following him because they know that there's a future with him. And they're going to do these great and wonderful things. And now he tells us he's going to die. We can't picture it because we have no understanding. Next week, we're going to look at where we left off, and we're going to explain that more thoroughly. And then we're going to go onward with Mark. God bless you, and thank you for being with us. Next week, 7 o'clock, Wednesday night.